Hi, I'm Beth Comstock. I'm here with Adam Grant. We're doing the Changemakers Book Club. I've got a bit of a different setting today. A big note of gratitude to WeWorks for letting us be here at the WeWork headquarters here in New York City. WeWorks had a really big month, announcing a lot of changes and a lot going on. So it seemed like a great setting to be here, where people are actually doing work while we talk about meaning and change at work, which is Adam's specialty. So Adam, thanks for being here and thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Beth.
So I doubt it needs introduction, but I'll take a minute and set up your background. Remind everyone that we're taking questions. So what we've done is we've got questions in advance through social, and we're asking people to post questions as we go forward.
Great.
So Adam is a best-selling author. You've had 3 books, at least that I know of. You may have had more.
I only know of 3.
You know of 3. You're a clinical, organizational psychologist. You're one of the best-loved professors at Wharton. And I did a little bit of homework. I found out that before you got into being the Adam Grant, the famous psychologist and author, you were a junior Olympic diver.
Long retired.
Long retired, and you also were a magician, which I found incredibly interesting.
Way long retired.
Yeah, so how does any of that play into what you're doing now and what the path you pursued as a psychologist and academic?
It's always clear in hindsight. I don't know if any of it really mattered, but I think the thing that jumps out about diving was, first, it was overcoming my fear. So I would stand on a 3-meter springboard, knowing that I was going to end up 20-some feet in the air, doing a bunch of somersaults and twists, and then hit the water at 20 or 30 miles an hour.
I'm afraid of the high dive.
I was too. So like figuring out how to motivate myself to do that was sort of an introduction to psychology. And then I coached for about 6 years. And so I would take these 12-year-olds up onto a 10-meter platform and try to get them to hurl themselves off. And I came away thinking, if you can motivate people to do that, there's a lot of stuff at work that's easier to motivate.
Good point. And then the magic?
I think what magic taught me was really an appreciation for the element of surprise. There's so many tricks that you could do where if you told people, here's what I'm going to do, they'd be like, so what? But if you set up an expectation for one thing to happen and then there was a twist, they were astonished. And I think that for me, a lot of social science is about that when you actually make explicit what people think is going to be true, and you can show them that there might be a time when the opposite is true, it's way more interesting.
I love that thought of that. I think the magic is really, it opens your imagination, because it really is, your mind playing tricks on you, right? It's reality, but your mind sees something totally different.
That's a really nice way to look at it. My wife's preferred response is to say, the Family Guy quote, that magic is at the very bottom of the hierarchy of entertainers, just above mimes. So,
do you do it at all? Do you do it for your kids' birthday parties or anything?
I've gone into our kids' classrooms, and on a show and tell day, I'll sometimes do magic tricks, and occasionally after I give a speech, people ask me to do tricks. So I tend to carry a deck of cards, which is like the nerdiest part of my life. Yeah.
You're not David Blaine or anything. You don't aspire to be David
Blaine?
No,
never.
Yeah. So a reminder, we're taking questions here with Adam Grant on the Changemakers Book Club. And the purpose of doing this was to introduce people to sort of share insights around best-loved books and thinkers, and really focus a lot on change. Before we jump into some of your books and some of the work, talk a little bit about how you go about writing books. You do a lot of research as part of your professional life, and how do you know what to research, and then how does it become a book?
I think, especially in psychology, a lot of research is really just me-search, and so
I love that. Say it again. A lot of research is really just me-search.
Which is sad in a way, right? Yeah. That we're so lacking in curiosity and empathy that we can only study the things that we've experienced. But I also think when you struggle with something, or when you excel at something, you find yourself wondering, anytime there's a surprise, bad or good, like, why did that happen? How can I avoid the bad? How can I create more of the good? Yeah. And so, I think the earliest topics I studied, had to do with experience that I'd had where I wanted a job that was going to have an impact on others. And I had a hard time, even in jobs that I thought were going to make a difference, feeling that. I worked as a lifeguard, and I never, ever went in the pool except on a hot day. 0 rescues, and so I thought I had this high-impact job. Yeah, and it was totally meaningless.
No Baywatch?
None whatsoever. Pool lifeguarding is very different from beach, it turns out. But I came out of that thinking there have to be ways to make this job it matters, but there have to be ways to make it meaningful. And I think some of the experiences were that. And then when I started teaching, a lot of it was, what are the questions I hear over and over again from students that I think are important but I can't answer? And then working with leaders, what are the questions they ask me too? And very often they're two sides of the same coin. Like I had students saying, I'm not the boss. How do I speak up and drive change? And then I had leaders asking, how do I fight groupthink? How do I get more good ideas? And I'm like, that's the same question.
So you call up people and say, hey, can I hang out at your company?
Yeah, sometimes. I think what's been most interesting is whenever I walk into an organization and I see something that directly contradicts or sort of disagrees with something that we think is true and that we have evidence for. And it's those moments of tension for me that lead me to say, okay, there's something we don't understand here and we need to study it.
Yeah. So I'm going to take one of the first questions, and reminder, we're taking questions here for Adam Grant. Any number of his books, we'll dig in now to originals. I want to start with originals. One of the first questions from Twitter came from Poonam Deeman. And Poonam asks, first of all, Poonam says, this is so cool. Adam is one of my favorite authors. I think you must get that a lot. And Poonam says, my question for Adam is this. What is the inspiration behind this book, Originals, which is not your latest, but one of your recent ones? What was the inspiration behind Originals? And a second part of that is, who's your role model?
Ooh. So the real inspiration for Originals is not one that I wrote about, which I regret now.
So we can say this is an exclusive or something?
It could be.
Yeah.
I think I've mentioned it
Facebook
here and there
Live
a few
exclusive.
times.
Okay,
but
well, for now, this moment, it's our
totally.
exclusive.
I opened the book with an embarrassing story about failing to invest in Warby Parker.
Yeah, I thought you were pretty brave to be honest about that.
I mean, there were a lot of people who didn't see that coming.
Yeah,
and
those guys are great.
It was one of the things that really led me to think a lot more about this topic, that I was so wrong about. I was like, you can't sell glasses online. You have to go get your eyes tested and you have to try them on. And clearly that was not right. And I think that when I was writing it, I was thinking a lot about how we judge other people's ideas. And what I forgot about is how challenging it is to judge our own ideas, which is really where I started on this question. So the experience that got me really thinking about this topic for the first time was in 1998. There was a group of high school seniors who all got into Harvard, and they were all over the country. They were going to be moving to Cambridge, Massachusetts. They didn't have any friends, and they wanted to arrive at college knowing some people. So they started, it was AOL at the time, they started searching AOL profiles to see if they could find their future classmates, and they found about 24 people that were all going, and they started an email list. And then every few weeks, a few people would add their friends or other people they just met. And by April, they had over 100 people on the email list, and they all met up at a pre-frosh weekend. And then in September, when they arrived at college, they had already connected over an eighth of the entering class online. And what's so interesting is there was an article about them in the school newspaper that called them Harvard's first online social network, essentially. They were called the E-Group. And
E-Group.
Yeah, the E-Group. And they met, and then they disbanded the group because they said, we all know each other. Why do we need to be connected online? And they've lived with regret ever since.
Right, it was so close.
Yeah, because Mark Zuckerberg starts Facebook in a dorm nearby a couple years later. And I think a lot of the founders of that network have been just sort of regretting that decision deeply, and I know that because I was one of the co-founders of that network.
Is that right? Oh, okay.
Look, I can't code, right? I never would have had Mark's vision for Facebook.
Yeah.
But I did, as I thought about that experience, reflect on how many of us have ideas that maybe it's just a little too early, or we count ourselves out too soon. And I wanted to write originals because I think everybody has ideas for improving the world around them, and too often we stop before actually giving them a shot.
Yeah.
So don't make my mistake, I guess is the lesson here.
And how about Poonam's question about your role model?
Role model.
Yeah, you probably have many, but give us one, maybe in context of originals.
I have a lot of role models. I think it's really hard to pinpoint just one. But when I think about originality, to me, the hardest part about being original is speaking up when you might have to challenge the status quo, or other people might disagree with you or object to your perspective. And so I think a lot about who are the people that have really stood up for something that matters. It's easy to think of Rosa Parks and Malala. When I think about it from an organizational perspective, it's hard not to mention Sheryl Sandberg here.
Yeah.
I think one of the most amazing things that Sheryl did was she started talking about Lean In at a time when there weren't a lot of people talking about gender in corporate America. And I think she's really stood up and been a champion for gender equality in a way that's convinced a lot of people, myself included, that we're not doing enough in the realm of feminism.
So, so I'm inviting you here to ask your questions. We've got Adam Grant, the author of multiple best-selling New York Times bestsellers, Wharton professor, big thinker. Let's dig into originals. So what I like about originals is, the subtitle is how nonconformists move the world. And what I like about this is that you basically say a lot of people can adopt these activities. And what I like is you define really this quest for better. I think you and I are very united on that. I think it's how you define an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
It's how you go forward. What does it take to be a nonconformist in companies today when we say we want nonconformists, but we don't recognize or reward them?
Yeah, this is, I want to hear your take on this too, Beth, because you've created a culture and helped shape a culture that allows more of this than it did before. I'll say in my experience, the biggest challenge I run into is, sort of the basic, well, this is the way we've always done it. That's one of my least favorite sentences. And I think that part of the responsibility of any leader in an organization is to say, well, I don't care how we've always done it. Let's ask how we should be doing it in the future. Yeah. And I think what successful nonconformists do is they're able to find examples from outside of their world that say, hey, look, this crazy thing that I want to do, this might actually work here. And they build a bridge in a way that makes their ideas seem less crazy. Yeah. So the Warby Parker example that's always jumped out at me is they started telling people, we're going to do for glasses what Zappos did for shoes.
It was a mind, they had created a framework.
Yeah, and it's like, 5 years ago I would have never ordered shoes online, and now I do it all at the time. Yeah. Or then they got called the Netflix for eyewear. And I remember that experience of driving to Blockbuster when I wanted to rent a movie, and then having to physically rewind it in my VCR in order to not be charged a late fee. We don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And so you start to look at those examples and you're like, oh, if those industries can be, disrupted a little bit by, internet retail, maybe glasses can too. And I think that too often people are looking at their ideas through a microscope when they should be looking through a telescope, right? They're focused on the details of how do I make this idea work, as opposed to asking, what else has worked that's kind of like this, and how can I show people that this is similar? Yeah, and you talk about we don't do it that way here. Another version of that I found is we tried that once. And you talked about this earlier, timing. I've come to appreciate just timing. I think that's actually a book at some point. Maybe someone's doing Dan
it.
Pink just wrote it. It's coming out next month. It's called
right?
When.
Well, I can't wait to read that because it's not just luck, right? Yeah. There's a certain strategy to timing. But you got to get it right.
Yeah.
So another a question that's just come in, taking from our audience, a reminder that we're taking questions, so live, and we've had people send in advance, but this is a question from Izomia, and Izomia, I'm going to just not get your name right. Hold on a second, I need to see this. Basically, for some reason it's not coming through, but basically Izomia's question is, how do you navigate, all the reaction of others who don't like dissent? You're coming out with a nonconformist perspective and they don't want dissent. How do you recommend people deal with that?
I think there are a few ways. It's always easier to deal with it proactively than reactively. So assume that you're dealing with somebody who might not be thrilled to have a dissenting opinion, and figure out, okay, how do I present my opinion so that it doesn't feel dissenting? I think the first way is you frame it as an advice request. There's this brilliant research by Katie Lillian-Quist, which shows that one of the best ways to influence people is to ask them for advice. So let's say, Beth, I wanted to get you to adopt, let's say FastWorks as a GE program before you had it. Instead of saying, hey, Beth, we're way too slow, we're bureaucratic, we're never getting anything done, and we're going to be put out of business.
Because I'm sure I've done that.
Well, we all have, I think. Yeah. But what I would say is, hey, Beth, I have this idea for speeding up innovation, and I know you're great at getting things done around here. I'd love your advice. How should I go about pursuing and exploring that? What Katie shows is, first of all, that flatters you, right? I'm kind of complimenting you. Yeah. To paraphrase Ben Franklin, we all admire the wisdom of people who come to us for advice. Right. Because let's face it, they have great taste, right? You're like, great, this guy knew to come to me.
Exactly.
But it also,
I knew I always liked them for a reason.
Of course, right? But there's also a force of perspective taking. That when I say, hey, how should I go about accomplishing this? You have to look at it from my vantage point and ask, well, how would I do that if I were you? And there's a positive emotion there. There's a kind of you put yourself on my side, and that leads you to give me suggestions, but also to step up and advocate for me. It only works though if I'm genuinely interested in your advice. So if I come here like trying to manipulate you, it will not be effective. You'll see through it. And so I have to come wanting to learn from you, but it's a great way to enlist allies.
It is. I love that ask for help. I think too often in work, I know early in my career I got feedback that I wasn't asking for help, and I sort of expected the idea to be perfect, and I'd come and say, here Adam, take my idea now, go with it. And Adam, you're like, well, wait a minute, you didn't ask me for help. Thanks. It's fully baked. And so I think we often assume that either it'll show where we don't know the answer, or you'll be inconvenienced. I mean, it's just the opposite to what, and research is backing that up.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it this way, but you're suggesting that when you bring somebody an idea early, it gives them a chance to buy in and take some ownership over it.
It does. I've often found that's really helpful with critics as well. There's certain critics that you're never going to win over. But some of the critics, if you just come to them early and say, actually, I like your critical thinking. We need, we're over optimistic about this. Tell us why we may not be understanding some of the downsides. So you're using their strength. I found that somewhat helpful.
That's fascinating. It reminds me of one of the things that I was puzzled by at first in my research, which was I found when I was writing originals, I found this evidence that we tend not to go to critics because we think our ideas are fragile, and we want the cheerleaders early on, and we're afraid of the skeptics. But if we can get them on board, they're actually better advocates. Because people will look at that person and be like, wow, George has never liked an idea in 32 years, but he's excited about this one. It must be a great one.
It's exactly it. And I've also, to that point, you shouldn't waste your time on the people who are never going to be part of it. And often we do that too. If I can just win him over. And meanwhile, he's never going to get it. He's not going to be there. But it's those people kind of who are open-minded and critical. They're critical thinkers. A couple of another question here. This is a question from LinkedIn from Brandon Buchanan. What 2 to 3 things do you do daily? So there's a question of you to set the stage for being your most creative self that day. And then Brandon asks, how do you change it up and vary your routine so you don't go stale?
I'm going to ask you to answer this one too. I think my most effective creative routines. One would be a 5-minute conversation with somebody who works in a completely different field from me, asking them about their routines, and then saying, okay, is there something here that I can adopt? A second one is I try to write in tiny chunks of time. So I used to think—
Say more. What's a tiny chunk of time?
Well, as a writer, I used to think I needed a 6-hour block in order to write. And then I read this research by Bob Boyce where he trained graduate students to write in 15-minute intervals and found that they were more likely to finish their dissertations.
15 minutes?
15 minutes. It's like, I can't even express a thought in 15 minutes, maybe a tweet. But I've actually found, even in 10-minute increments, I can get the seed of an idea out, and then it forces me to leave it unfinished, and then it's stuck in my head.
Processing in the background.
Exactly, and then unconscious thought sort of takes over. So I love that, and I actually look for those windows between meetings, or when I'm between teaching and office hours, to say, all right, I'm just going to jot some ideas, and then it'll finish itself.
Yeah, that's such a good idea. I'm big on, to your question, I'm big on making room for discovery. I feel like that's how I get my creative energy, whether it's online or finding someone new to talk to. Constantly, I'm a big believer in you have to schedule that time for discovery.
Do you schedule it every day?
I don't. I try to schedule it certainly every week. I'm probably not as successful when I'm sitting in that 6th hour of a meeting. I'm going like, this is not the best use of my time. But I think it is a good note to try to do that. So a couple of other. You talked earlier about fear. You were talking about being a diving coach. A lot of fear comes into taking risks, and if you're a nonconformist, are you fearless?
No, not at all. This is another surprise that I kind of always thought that these people who are great at championing original ideas, they're cut from a different cloth. They're biologically immune to fear. They don't process risk the same way the rest of us do. And I sought out a lot of great original thinkers and talked to them about this dynamic. I talked to Elon Musk and Larry Page and a whole bunch of others, mostly in tech. And I asked them, what was it like before the idea made it? And how did you find the courage to go for it? And every one of them said, I was terrified. And
we don't believe that. We think Elon Musk wakes up and hello world, you'll whatever, bring it on.
No, but in reality, Elon said, I had done online payments and I had to go to Russia and convince people to sell me a rocket. And they looked at me and they said, haha, online payment, go back to that. You're never going to get into space. And that even made him more fearful. But what was really interesting about each of their thinking was they did this mental time travel where they said, okay, in the moment, it is always scarier to fail. But in the long run, the scariest thing is not trying.
Yeah.
And when you look, 20 or 30 years ahead and, you're kind of looking back at your current self, you're like, what am I going to regret more? Yeah. Failing or failing to try.
Yeah.
And so a lot of them, they motivated themselves by doing that exercise and saying, look, I'm going to get in a time machine in my head and I'm going to sort of talk to my future self. My future self always wants to give these things a shot. And I think that, that magnifies the desirability of going for it, and it minimizes sort of the pain of thinking, well, yeah, you know what, I failed last year and I don't worry about that on a daily basis anymore, so maybe this probably won't stay with me.
I like that idea of imagining your future self. For me, it's a version of that of just saying, like, I believe in better, and if I see a better or I believe there's a better way, I have an obligation to help make it happen. I can't ignore it. It's almost like it's as if it's as real as you sitting here.
Yeah.
And that takes some of the fear out of it, because suddenly it's like, this has to get done.
It does, and I think there's a Frameshift that helps with that. Some years ago, Amy Resnesky and I studied how people sort of persist in areas where they might either lack confidence or might be overconfident. And we found that one of the key motivators that a lot of people used was thinking about who they were letting down. If you only think about yourself, fear is going to be paralyzing, because you're thinking, okay, this could embarrass me, it could limit my career, hurt my reputation. But when you focus on the others who are depending on you, it's way easier to say, you know what, yeah, this might cost me a little, but it could benefit others a lot, and it's worth a shot because of that.
So a couple of other questions here. Reminder, we're taking questions. This is Facebook Live Changemakers Book Club. We're here at WeWorks. So there's a lot happening at WeWork behind us, and really it's fun to see WeWork as a changing face of the way we work.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. Much more collaborative office space, this idea. I mean, give us a sense of what you're seeing in the future of work. What excites you about the future of work?
I think the most exciting part of it is the obvious, which is I hope that we can automate more work that people don't want to do, that's soul crushing as opposed to inspiring or meaningful. And I think that for me a lot of that is really bad sort of assembly line style service jobs where there's no ingenuity, there's no chance to exercise your skills or develop your capabilities. And I think that the fear is that if those jobs go away, then there aren't going to be jobs to replace them. And I've taken a long view on this and said, look, people were terrified when cars were invented, that they were going to displace this whole transportation industry, and they did eliminate a lot of jobs, but they also created a lot of new jobs. And I think that's going to happen here too. And my hope is that part of the future of work is a lot more creative. What's fun about this to me is I had a couple of sort of, I guess I would say, disconcerting discussions with people at the forefront of tech who said, well, we're not that far from artificial intelligence doing creativity. I could take all the paintings or songs in human history and put them into a neural network, and then there's an objective function, and it could spit out great art or music. And I look at that and say, yeah, that might be possible one day, but I don't want to buy that.
Yeah, and
I don't care if a computer makes a painting.
Copying, is it? I'm still with you. I bet on the spirit of the human. I bet on human creativity. But at the heart of this sort of future of work is fear again. Back to that fear, and people need to. I find that the more you can expose people to new ways of working. I mean, again, here we are in an open office space. I remember at a time when people didn't want to give up their office for fear that, I think it was a control thing, but you didn't know because you hadn't worked in one.
You talk a lot about imagination.
Yeah.
And I know part of what you've been doing for the past few years is trying to reimagine what the future of work looks like. What are you most excited about? Well,
I'm most excited about creativity and judgment and strategy. I think that in companies, we are going to ask for more of our people, no matter what your function, to be more creative, to have more, use your judgment. I work in a company, GE, which makes great things, and trust me, you want really great process rigor when you're making some of our amazing machinery.
Yeah.
But there are also times when you can't do something by a checklist. You need to say, what do you think? What's your hypothesis? What did you learn? These are not things you're going to find from an algorithm, I don't think, at least not yet. So we have a question here that has come in from Denise Donovan. Denise is asking you, how can we accelerate change in an organization without sounding critical and negative?
One of the best pieces of advice I've gotten on that is from Carmen Medina, who worked at the CIA for a long time, and then Deloitte. And Carmen said the biggest thing she learned as she was rocking the boat was that you have to stand for something, not just against something. I have a colleague who put it a little differently. He said, if you're going to point out that the emperor has no clothes, you might want to make sure that you're a pretty good tailor first. And I think that's good advice.
Yeah.
I think people are often looking for what's the alternative. If you're going to criticize something, you should have an improvement. I think the other thing that I've often struggled with, which I've tried to become clearer about, is kind of the reverse, which is I watch a lot of people who are super excited about a solution and they've never articulated the problem. And there's a way
That's another good question. What problem are you trying to solve?
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Like
Start
why are
with
you doing this? And I think that very often what happens is they seem critical because they're immediately saying, I have a better way, when they haven't just unpacked what are the issues that have led you to look for this better way. And that doesn't feel like criticism. That feels like problem solving. We all like problems to be solved.
You talk about procrastination as the enemy. You say here's a great quote: procrastination may be the enemy of productivity, but it can be a great resource for creativity. That is so unexpected. So it made me feel really good for all the things I put off. You're saying put off things and you'll be more creative.
No, I do not want you to procrastinate more.
Okay.
What I am saying is there's a class of people like me who are precrastinators.
So what's a precrastinator?
I feel, that urgency you feel when you have a big deadline coming up tomorrow? I felt that 6 months ago. And I feel like when I was writing originals, for example, the day that I signed the contract to write it was the day I felt like it needed to be done. And what that means is I will often rush forward with my first ideas as opposed to waiting for the best ideas. Or I will write a chapter about the question I have today as opposed to the more interesting question that I might have in 2 weeks. And I was struck by both examples from Da Vinci to Martin Luther King Jr. to Abraham Lincoln of them doing their very best work when they were procrastinating, when they felt like they should be working on it, but they got distracted by something else, or they didn't know how to figure it out yet, and so they put it off. And sometimes that did force them to incubate. And I had a student who studied this and found some evidence both in companies and in some controlled experiments that when we tempted people to procrastinate and they knew something would need to be done but they put it off, they actually did have more ideas and more creative ideas. And so I think it's really something for people who tend to feel the pressure to think in linear ways or be done early.
And
yeah, exactly.
Part of what you're saying as a nonconformist is you have to have an idea, but you also have to get action.
Yeah.
And you're saying don't get action too early.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's such a thing as being too late, but there is also a too early problem.
Too early. And I'm hearing you also say this idea of sort of dual processing, that you need time to sort of sort through, your brain needs to be thinking about these ideas in the background.
Yeah, I mean, in Da Vinci's case, he worked on the Mona Lisa on and off for about 16 years, we think. And in 1 year, he got distracted by these...
It makes me feel so much better about some things I've been working on.
It would, except I'm not going to come out with a Mona Lisa
at the end
of it.
I'm kidding. I'm not.
No, but he had, at one point he got distracted by optics experiments in light. And, he gets curious about that. I guess we won't be painting this year. But then they changed the way that he models light in that painting, and it's now, he's the Renaissance man.
Really interesting. So reminder, Changemaker Book Club. Here we are with Adam Grant, the New York Times bestselling author and Wharton professor. We're here at WeWork headquarters in New York City. A question came in from Delaria Casey on LinkedIn. And Delaria asked, what small exercises do you recommend to expand your way of thinking? And Delaria also asked, what else would you recommend avoiding? So this is one. Don't be too quick to get something done.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, and I think on small thinking exercises, my favorite one is perspective taking. I always think about this with mentoring. I have a lot of students who think that they need to find their mentor and then spend as much time with that mentor as possible. And I think that's totally backward. Research on mentoring shows it's not about one person, it's about having a developmental network of people with different expertise, different experiences, different skills, who can challenge you and stretch you in different ways. Yeah. And so what I think is the way to approach mentoring is figure out who are the people who have ways of solving problems or frameworks that you want to learn, and watch their videos, read their books, talk to them if you have access to them. And then your goal is to internalize the way they would think So that instead of having to say, I have this dilemma, I need to call Beth for the 19th time, I can ask myself, how would Beth approach this problem? But I also have 7 other people, and I know the way that they would think. I know what their heuristics are, I know what their routines are. And I think we should all practice more often rapid fire. I've got a decision or a dilemma. Let me pick the 4 people whose perspectives I admire. How would they approach this problem?
That sounds like a great way for teams as well, when you're doing team exercises, that you all have these heuristics, and to say, let's use this approach, the Grant method, the Comstock method, whatever. I like that as an approach. There's so much that you're laying out there in terms of getting our head around it. What about what not to do?
Well, I think some of that is, I worry about the limits of individual experience quite a bit. I work with too many leaders who say, well, I've been working on this, in this area for a decade, and therefore we need to. And I just look at that and say, why would you only want to learn from a decade of your idiosyncratic experiences when you can learn from lots of people's experiences at once? And so the question that I always love to ask is, what is the best evidence on this topic? And a lot of times you worry that that's going to leave you trapped in the way things have been done before. Yeah. But more often the answer to that question is we don't have good evidence on that topic. And that's an invitation to run an experiment, to go try something new.
Yeah, I love that as a good question. I'm thinking, I thought your point about, it ties into your point about having a network. I feel like in my career, if there's one of the things I'm proudest of is being able to develop a network. And networking gets a bad rap in some ways. And you talk about it in Give and Take, your first book. Because most people, when we think about networking, we think it's just like the sleazy, cheesy, hey, what are you going to do for me now? Hey, Adam, I'll call you, let's do a deal. And really, it's about creating a relationship and understanding shared interests. And I love that idea about using your network more thoughtfully for the frameworks of what these people can represent.
Yeah, I think that a great mentor is not somebody who tells you what to think. It's somebody who teaches you how to think. I think on networking, I'm curious to hear your take on this. I have seen, there are a lot of people who have this distaste. They're like, I don't want to be transactional. But then they end up being transactional about relationship building. Yeah. So I've gotten outreach over the past few months more often than I expected from strangers saying, I want to build a relationship with you. And I just look at that and say, I have enough relationships in my life. I don't need more relationships. What would be better is if you came in and just said, here's a question I have. This is why I chose you. Of anyone on earth that I could have asked, I think you have a unique perspective because. And then, approaching that thoughtfully makes me more likely to want to engage with that person again. Do you see this too? Do you see people asking? It's like asking for marriage on the first date.
Yeah, it is. And it's a lot of what you said. I think there's pressure for all of us, especially early in our careers, to say, I have to have a mentor. I have to have a perfect mentor. And this mentor is going to tell me exactly what I need to do. When the mentor is there to just give you advice. A coach is quite different even, right? A coach is someone who's investing a little bit more time in what you're doing. But I love that idea. I mean, the more thoughtful the person is who's reaching out to you, the more you want to respond to them.
What else signals to you that someone's thoughtful when they get in touch?
Well, I think they've done their homework. They say, hey, I've read things you've written about. I know you're talking about this kind of change element. I've faced this dilemma. Have you? Have you seen it other places? And it's okay if you get back to me not right away. An email's fine. Giving me the space to be thoughtful and respond on my terms. I think that's really helpful.
You've just given people a recipe to get more of your time.
Well, I'm always, and I actually get a lot from the incoming as well. I would imagine you do too. The questions that come in are often as critical as the response you're going to give them because you're seeing a new perspective on things. So we have another question we have a question here from Mark Dawes via Twitter. And this is about sustaining creativity and organization, looking at organizations sustaining originality over time. Mark writes, the venture markets are really concerned about a decline in innovativeness in startup ecosystems. What might be causing this? And are diversity and inclusion programs potential solutions? And then he goes on to ask, how about shifting recruiting focus from the coast to Midwest? So I take it as just, are we losing our touch with realizing the diversity of thought and ideas, and how critical is that, and what does your research say?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I think what we're driving at is diversity of thought if we want people to innovate. But diversity of background, of life experience is one of the best proxies for diversity of thought we have available. David Leonhardt had an article in the New York Times just in the past day or so, which had a stunning statistic It was a report on a new analysis that economists have done of what they call lost Einsteins, which are people who have a tremendous amount of innovative potential and never made it to do something original.
I know, that's like such a weird compliment, right?
But I always wonder how many people would have been in
you
that
could have,
bucket.
but we all fear that, don't we? That
Yeah.
we could have been Einstein and we missed our chance.
Or our kids will miss that chance. Or when I think about that, the thing that jumped out at me in the analysis was oftentimes you think about a certain degree of precociousness as relevant. So you look at third grade math aptitude as a signal of is somebody going to become a world-changing inventor or physicist. And then they follow these third graders all the way into adulthood and they track their lifetime patents. And it turned out that if you were in the top 5% of your third grade sort of writ large in math skills, but you came from a low-income family, you're less likely to hold patents and become an inventor than somebody who's below average in math and came from an affluent family. And I think Steve Case put it really well. He said, look, creativity is broadly distributed, opportunity is not.
Yeah.
And I think we do a horrible job giving people who are not in high-income areas access to education, to opportunity, to chances to try out new ideas.
So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to make sure we touch on a couple of other things. So your most recent book, you worked with Sheryl Sandberg on Option B, which was, I would imagine, a tough book for you guys to have done under some tough circumstance, but you raised this point of resilience, and it's probably one of the most important issues in business today. Talk about resilience. I mean, what does it mean to you? How to, at a personal, individual level, and then at an organizational level?
Yeah, I mean, it was a book that we didn't want to have to write, but Sheryl got so much overwhelming feedback when she wrote a post after her husband Dave died about what she'd learned and how we should think about dealing with adversity, that it felt like the right thing to do to write it. I think on a personal level, I've always thought about resilience as the strength and speed of your response to adversity. And it's
I love that. Say it again. The strength and speed of your response to adversity.
Yeah. So
and often you don't know you have it until you're tested.
No,
right?
That's right. And I think that very often the speed factor is emphasized over the strength factor. So people say, I actually had a colleague who went through a very tragic loss, and about a week later said, I feel like I'm not resilient because I haven't bounced back yet. And I said, you haven't even grieved yet. These things unfold in their own way at their own time, and that's different for everyone. And when I think about the speed, it's not, can you bounce back tomorrow from something that's life-altering?
Wrong expectations, adding pressure. It sounds
exactly. Like. It's more about saying, can in a time frame that you think is reasonable, can you begin to rebuild your life? And is this not dragging you down for an extended period of time, of months or years? And I think the strength part is something we really underestimate. One of my favorite things to ask people is it just drives me crazy that people encounter someone who's facing adversity and they just offer unsolicited advice. And if I could offer unsolicited advice, it would be don't give unsolicited advice.
I love that. But people mean well, right? They want, it's an
awkward
awkward situation. They want to help.
Of course. But instead of telling somebody what you've learned from your experience, you can help them learn from their experience. Best question I have been asked and learned to ask people is, what's the worst adversity you faced before, and how did you overcome that? Because there are probably lessons from your own, experiences that you can learn, and very often you're not thinking about those. You're zoomed in on the experience that you have today, and not realizing 10 years ago I went through something hard, and maybe I can extract some insight from how I coped with that.
So reminder, this is Changemaker Book Club. I'm here with Adam Grant. A few more questions to wrap up. We got a question from Christy Hoskin via LinkedIn, and Christy said she'd love to hear thoughts on ways to mentor and empower others around resilience. One is ask them a good question, but can you coach people to be resilient?
Yeah, I think you can.
Take them out into the middle of the woods somewhere and make them find their way home?
I hope not. Although I think there is something to be said for being put in challenging situations that are not life-threatening, because you get to practice the skills. I think one of the most important skills that we can teach to others is self-compassion. I think many people are better at compassion for others than they are for themselves. I love Kristen Neff's research on this, where she says we're so terrible at treating others with treating ourselves with the same kindness we would show to a good friend. And I think one of the best things you can do if you're trying to help other people be resilient is to ask them, if you encountered somebody else who was going through this, what would you say to them? what kind of understanding and support would you show them? And very often, you're much harsher on yourself than you would have been on someone else.
Yeah.
And that makes it easier for, that person to say, all right, this is something everyone goes through. It's normal to struggle. I shouldn't beat myself up over this.
And I think you're making a really good point for failure at work as well, because we both know from hanging around Silicon Valley and startup teams that, the mantra is fail fast, fail small. No one likes to fail.
No.
And there's that little voice in your head that's going, you idiot, this is it. I have that. You talk about the fear factor of being on a high dive. I get that I'm making a mistake, and it's like this visceral response in my stomach, and it's that voice in your head.
Yeah.
It's not that somebody else has yelled at you. It's just yourself going, you're an idiot, and you walk in and you don't have confidence, and how can anyone else have confidence in you?
I think that a lot of Silicon Valley's gotten this wrong. That that people are they think they're supposed to aim for failure. You should never aim for failure, in my opinion. What we're supposed to do is normalize failure, so that people set ambitious goals and have high aspirations, and then say, if I failed, was it a good experiment to run so that I learned something?
So I want to end on two last questions for you. So Give and Take was your first book. I remember reading an article about you, I think in the New York Times Magazine, and it was just as the book was coming out. But there was just so much, you just came onto the scene, and this idea of givers and takers, that was 2013 when the book came out. So maybe quickly tell us what it was about, and then anything that, as your research or as time's gone on, that you look back and maybe has changed or you've thought about it differently? I
feel like that's a question every author wishes they got asked more, because we would all rewrite our books after the book tour and after we've gotten reader feedback. I think for me, Give and Take was really about, is it possible to be successful and generous at the same time? And I've come across too many people who think you have to be a selfish taker to get ahead.
Yeah, and we've seen people who've done it too.
Yeah, we have.
Not for long.
Yeah, often they fail in the long run, but not always. Sometimes they accumulate enough power that they're able to protect their standing. I think a lot of actually the sexual harassment scandals are takers finally getting the punishment they deserve.
That's a good way to think about it.
But I think that one of the things that I failed to think systematically about when writing the book was, I think that it's very easy to say, look, if you encounter a taker, you'd rather not have to deal with that person, so avoid them. But some people are stuck working for selfish bosses. And
in fact, that was some of the questions we got. I work for a taker.
What do I do?
And what do I do?
I've gotten that question a ton, and I don't think we have that much good research on it.
Yeah.
But I think the most important thing I've learned about how to manage those situations is that sometimes you can gently help people see their reputation, and you have to do this without sort of letting them shoot the messenger. But I have watched people, and there's a little bit of evidence to back this up, say, hey, I just wanted to let you know these are the things that people are saying about you. And if I were in your shoes, I would want to hear it. You probably don't want to say that to the wrong person. But there's a time and a place where reputational feedback leads people to sort of look in the mirror and say, well, I don't want to be known that way, and that might jeopardize my success. And sometimes in the right moment, it can lead people to turn over a new leaf.
You're making a point about feedback. I'm a big believer, and increasingly so, just the value of regular, ongoing feedback, asking for it, giving for it, giving it, actually, taking it into consideration. It's hard. It's really hard. So the last thing I want to ask you about as we end, again, Changemaker Book Club. So fortunate to be here with Adam Grant. Thank you. It's been a great discussion. We're here at WeWork, their headquarters in Manhattan. So you see a lot of activity behind us. But let's end on this notion of sort of trying to wrap it all together. We've talked about originals, nonconformists, disrupting around creativity. We've talked about giving and sort of being successful and giving. We've talked about resiliency, coming back after great adversity. All that ladders up, I think, to finding meaning and meaning at work. And that's really what your career has been about. Any insights in what you think makes a meaningful job? And if you're watching, if there was one thing someone took away, like how do I get more meaning into my job, what would you tell them?
Yeah, it's a question I've been passionate about my whole career. I think the big takeaway from decades of research on meaning is that meaning is not about you. The most meaningful jobs are the ones that help others. And some of that is designed into the job, right? It's useful if you're a firefighter or a nurse or a physician, right, that you save lives. But some of that is also built into the way that you choose to interact with other people and the way that you try to contribute to their lives. And I think the great test of whether your job is meaningful is to say, look, if my job didn't exist, or I didn't do it the way I do it, how many people would be worse off, and how much worse off would they be? And if the answer is no one and not much, then it's worth trying to figure out, how do I make that job more meaningful, and how do I have more impact on others?
And you're raising something that I feel very passionate about. I think the self-permission we need to give ourselves. The boss isn't going to always tell you to do that. You're not going to get an engraved invitation that says reach out to people on your team and offer to coach them, help someone through a problem, help solve something. I mean, partly it's just making yourself available and accessible, and I think that takes practice, I think, often in organizations. So, Adam, thank you so much. Just great to see you. Always, I feel like
Likewise,
come away
Beth. Thank you.
with all kinds of really simple actions and big, deep thoughts as well. Adam Grant, here on Changemakers Book Club. Thank you. We'll see you next time. Thanks to WeWork for allowing us to be here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.